Let us pretend that Intel did not launch the Core Ultra 200S Arrow Lake set of processors 3 months ago. Let's instead consider that period to have been beta testing as they updated drivers, firmware, management engine software and Windows 11 24H2. And now let's consider today to be the launch of these new processors and the accompanying Z890 motherboards. There is of course a snag with that way of thinking, which is that in the interim AMD has launched the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, which is a banger of a gaming processor. So let's take a look at these brand new Core Ultra 200S processors and see whether they're good for productivity and gaming. Or should you instead stick with 14th gen Raptor Lake, or is AMD Zen 5 the best choice for your money? In appearance, these three Core Ultra 200S processors, Ultra 9, Ultra 7, Ultra 5, are very similar to these three Raptor Lake 14th gen Core i9, Core i7, Core i5, but they're actually quite different. You see what I mean about the appearance? So I think it's worth taking a few seconds just to do a recap of what is new with Core Ultra 9, Ultra 7 and Ultra 5. At launch there were 5 models of processor: the Core Ultra 9 285K, the Core Ultra 7 265K and KF, in other words no graphics, and the Core Ultra 5 245K and KF. At CES of this year, Intel launched some more models: Core Ultra 9 285 without the K and 265 and 245. However, you'll note these are 65 watt parts, and that's a big step down from the Ultra 9 285K and Ultra 7 265K, which have a TDP of 250 watts, and the Core Ultra 5 245K, which is 159 watts. So 250 or 159 down to 65. These are very different parts on the face of it. So we have the product stack of 5 parts and we have dollar pricing. The Core Ultra 9 285K has a price of $589, currently available here in the UK at £600 including VAT. The Core Ultra 7 265K is $394, currently £380 here in the UK, and the Core Ultra 5 245K $309, currently £290 here in the UK. When we look at the stack of parts and their full specifications, on the first line we see P cores and E cores. The Ultra 9 has 24 cores, which is 8 P cores, 16 E cores. The Core Ultra 7 is very similar, 8 P cores and 12 E cores. And the Core Ultra 5 245K, 6 P cores and 8 E cores. However, when you look at the second line, you'll see threads 24, 20 and 14. And the core count is the same as the thread count. The reason is that Intel has removed SMT in these processors. It's not disabled, it simply does not exist. There is no hyperthreading. This makes for an interesting comparison when you hark back to the 14th gen Raptor Lakes, and we see Core i9 14900K is 24 cores, 8 plus 16, but 32 threads. Core i7 14700K is 20 cores, 8 plus 12, 28 threads. Core i5 14600K, 14 cores, 6 plus 8, and 20 threads. So we have to hope these new Core Ultra 200S bring something special to the party, because the cut in threads could significantly hurt performance. We can also see that under the heat spreader these processors are very different to Raptor Lake. They use a disaggregated design and are built using a variety of chiplets. It so happens these chiplets or tiles are made by TSMC rather than Intel, and that's unusual. And when we look more closely at the compute tile, we see the layout of P cores and E cores. They're not in 2 simple blocks. In other words, each pair of P cores is separated by 4 E cores. The upshot, according to Intel, is a landmark reduction in power, along with leadership in core performance. And then then Intel goes on to tell us there's a massive reduction in power for Core Ultra 9 285K compared to Core i9 14900K. But of course we all know that Raptor Lake can draw a huge amount of power. Intel also tells us that Ultra 9 285K with 24 threads compares very favourably to AMD's Ryzen 9 9950X with 32 threads, and that's a bold claim. The upshot is, in gaming, a huge reduction in system power. In Warhammer Space Marines 2, 165 watts reduction of complete system power. Age of Mythology Retold, 136 watts. Other games, 60 to 80 watts. And in gaming, Core Ultra 9 285K beats the Ryzen 9 9950X in a number of games. It also loses in a few, but overall it's pretty much on par. This slide compares the Ultra 7 265K for some reason rather than the Ultra 9 to the Core i9 14900K, up to 188 watts lower system power and an operating temperature of 15 degrees lower. To work with your new CPU, you'll need a new motherboard using an 800 series chipset. At launch this was the Z890, but at CES Intel launched the B860, which is very similar and has slightly fewer PCI Express lanes. And to bring us right up to date, I recently discussed in a video the changes Intel announced at CES 2025, where they told us about fixes for performance to Arrow Lake. They told us about APO, which boils down to installing the latest version of Windows 11 24H2, and also changes to the power plan within Windows 11 such that the balanced power plan is now the same as the high performance power plan. Other changes relate to the processor power management, and also a slightly obscure setting called CCF Auto GV, and the need to install the latest BIOS for your Z890 motherboard, which will fix the management engine or ME firmware. And once everything's up to date, your Core Ultra 200S is ready for action, and in our case ready for benchmarking. As I explained in my recent video about retesting Core Ultra 200S with all the updates, I've got 3 sets of testing hardware. So for Core Ultra 200S, the Arrow Lake processors, I have the 3 processors, obviously, and I'm testing those on this motherboard, the MSI Meg Z890 Ace, which I've now been using on and off for 3 months. Loads of updates, very good motherboard. And that motherboard and the processors are allied to this memory, which is G-Skill Trident Z5CK CU DIMMs, and they are rated at 8200 mega transfers. It's a 48GB kit, 2x24GB, and it's the latest spec of memory. I'm using 3 Crucial T700 Gen 5 SSDs, one for each of my 3 platforms, and yes, I've used some sticky tape so I can keep track of which SSD is for which platform. I've got here a Gigabyte Z790 motherboard. It's the Aorus Master X, that's Z790 chipset of course. That's for the 3 Raptor Lake processors, i9, i7, i5 14th gen. And I'm using some G-Skill Trident Z5 RGB memory rated at 6800 mega transfers. These processors work fairly well on 6000, work better as the memory gets faster. Somebody commented under my last video I should use 7200 mega transfer memory. 6800, it's not holding the processors back. And then for AMD, the motherboard is this MSI MPGX870E Carbon Wi-Fi. I reviewed this board, I liked it a great deal. This is the board on the stand here. I'm using some G-Skill Trident Z5 rated at 6000 mega transfers. That's an Expo profile, so that's for AMD. When I showed you my figures just over a week ago now, I showed you Ryzen 9 9950X and also the processor installed, which is Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. Since then I've added a few more processors to the equation: Ryzen 5 9600X, Ryzen 7 9700X, And I've also added in the Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. A few people requested in the comments. A few other parts of the test system that are significant: an MSI RTX 4090 Ventus 3X graphics card, and my power supply. I'm using a Seasonic Vertex GX 1200. Thus, in some other retesting I've done in recent weeks, I used this Focus ATX3. It's the 4th gen of Focus, I believe. The Vertex, which is ATX3, worked absolutely fine, and this Focus ATX 3.1 has also worked absolutely fine. And the final part of the test systems, which was used on all 3 of the platforms, an MSI Mag Core Liquid i360 liquid cooler, 360mm AIO, worked absolutely superbly. It is a very cool time of the year here in the UK, and I'm sure that helped. Plus, I'm running all 3 processor families on default power limits. Cooling was absolutely no trouble whatsoever. And now let's move on to our chart. Let's start with the chart that should be familiar from previous videos. The color coding here: blue for Core Ultra 200, red for AMD Zen 5, green for Intel Raptor Lake 14th Gen, and yellow for older AMD, which is Zen 4. This is Cinebench 2024 multi-core. Top of the chart we have the Core Ultra 9 285K running at 235 watts and a clock speed on the P cores of 5.4 GHz. And you can see it clearly beats the Ryzen 9 9950X running at 5 GHz on 200 watts. Fewer threads, higher clock speed, slightly more power. Result. Step down to the 5th line on the chart, you'll see the Core Ultra 7 265K, which is a couple of places ahead of the Core i7 14700K, and it's running on about 10% less power. And then just below the middle of the chart, we have the Core Ultra 5 245K running on 135 watts, which beats the Core i5 14600K on 176 watts. This is a good start for the Core Ultra 200S processors. Next up, Cinebench 2024 single core. Top of the chart, it's the Core Ultra 9 285K running on single thread, which is single core in this instance. The processor requires 50 watts. In second place, we have the Ryzen 9 9950X running at the same clock speed and requiring 58 watts. In third place, we have the Core i9 14900K also running at 5.7 GHz and requiring 55 watts. In other words, these 3 processors are running at the same clock speeds. You can see the power difference, and you can see there is a small performance difference. Step down to 6th and 7th place on the chart and you'll see the Ultra 7 265K and the Ultra 5 245K pretty much tied, and a clear distance ahead of the Core i7 14700K and the Core i5 14600K. Moving on to Geekbench 6 multi-core, we see Core Ultra 9 285K at the top of the chart, closely followed by Ryzen 9 9950X. Surprisingly, tight behind that we have Core Ultra 7 265K, and then we have Core i9 14900K and Core i7 14700K. If you look just below the midpoint of the chart, you can see that Core Ultra 5 265K leads Core i5 14600K by a narrow head. Geekbench 6 single core is interesting because it is dominated by AMD Zen 5. The spread of scores is quite small. The Ryzen 9 9950X at the top of the chart, 3436, and down in 6th place the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, 3327, so just over 100 points out of 3300. And then behind that we have the Core Ultra 9 285K, and a few places lower the Core i9 14900K. The next chart is for CPU power consumption in Cinebench 2024 during a 10-minute run. In my previous video this caused a bit of conflict. Some of you seemed to be appalled I was running 14th gen Raptor Lake on a mere 253 watts. To reiterate, this is Intel default power limits. Of course you can run it on 300, 350 or 400 watts, at which point the temperature will rocket up and the longevity of the CPU might be affected. The key takeaways here: Raptor Lake i7 and i9 253 watts, Core Ultra 9 235 watts, Core Ultra 7 220 watts, Ryzen 9 9950X 200 watts, and when you drop down to the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, 120 watts under full load. The next chart is 7-zip version 24. Top of the chart, Ryzen 9 9950X, and that's by a clear margin. Second, we have the Core i9 14900K, and third, the Core i7 14700K. Fourth place is the Core Ultra 9 285K, and behind that we have the Ryzen 9 9900X. You can see here I'm essentially averaging the two scores to choose their position within the chart. You can see the Ryzen 9 9900X has a very good decompressing figure and a rather lower compressing figure. After that we have the Core Ultra 7 265K, and you have to go way down the chart to find the Core Ultra 5 245K. And the result for that processor is distinctly odd because the compressing figure is higher than the decompressing figure. Ada 64 memory bandwidth. The memory of course plays a huge part in this test, but the processor also has a hand in things. Top of the chart we have the Core Ultra processors, which are running DDR5 8200 CU DIMMs, and you can see the Ultra 9 is top, Ultra 7 is second, Ultra 5 is third. After that we have the Raptor Lake 14th gen parts running DDR5 6800, Core i9 and Core i7 tie. Core i5 is a small margin behind them. Then we come to AMD. The Zen 5 parts do very nicely, Ryzen 9 beating Ryzen 7 because of the dual core complex nature of those processors, and the various Ryzen 7s and Ryzen 5s are in a dead heat, regardless of whether they're Zen 5 or Zen 4 parts. It's worth at this point having a quick look at the latency of the memory. We can see that Core i9 14900K running DDR5 6800 has a latency of 64.7, but if you increase the memory speed to DDR5 8000, the latency drops to 61.0 nanoseconds. On the other hand, Core Ultra 200S with DDR5 8200 CU DIMMs, significantly faster memory, the latency is not good. We have three figures here, 88.8, 86.6 and 90.2. In other words, 88 or 89 nanoseconds on average. Clearly that latency looks concerning. The question is whether or not it actually affects performance in the real world. And when we look at the overall score in 3D Mark TimeSpy, we wonder whether the memory might be playing a part here. Top of the chart, Core i7 14700K, and very slightly behind that, Core i9 14900K. In essence, the two Raptor Lake parts in a dead heat. Then we have the Core Ultra 9 285K, pretty much tied with the Core i5 14600K. Going down the chart, Core Ultra 7, the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, Core Ultra 5, and then four more AMD parts. You'll notice the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is second from the bottom, just above the Ryzen 5 9600X. Moving on from that synthetic test, we come to the first of our games, Far Cry 6 at 1080p on Ultra preset. Top of the chart, it's the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, and in second place the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. Significant that Zen 5 3D has a big lead over Zen 4 3D, but both of those processors are clear away from the Core i9 14900K and the Core i7 14700K. You have to go way down the chart to find the Core Ultra 9 285K, just above the Ryzen 5 9600X, and then the Core Ultra 7 265K and Core Ultra 5 245K are both at the bottom. The next game is Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, again at 1080p on Ultra preset. Top of the chart, Ryzen 7 9800X 3D in what will become a common refrain. Second, it's the Ryzen 9 9950X. Then we have the three Core Ultra parts, Ultra 9, Ultra 7, Ultra 5. But you'll notice they're positioned above the Core i7, Core i9 and Core i5 because of the 1% lows rather than the averages. Those figures are pretty much identical. 1% lows, there is some separation. Below that we have the Zen 4 Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, and then the Ryzen 7 9700X, and at the bottom the Ryzen 5 9600X. Assassin's Creed Mirage at 1080p on ultra high preset. Top of the chart, Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, followed by Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. Then we have Raptor Lake i9 and i7, the Ryzen 9 9950X, and we come to the Ultra 9 285K, and you can see the Ultra 7 265K and the Ultra 5 245K are a distance behind. Next we have Total War Pharaoh at 1080p on ultra preset. Top of the chart, Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, followed by the Ryzen 9 9950X, the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, and the Ryzen 7 9700X. Then we come to the i9 14900K, the Ryzen 5 9600X, and finally we reach the Core Ultra 9 285K. In other words, it is cleanly beaten by the Ryzen 5 9600X, which is just bizarre. Then we have the Core i7, the Core Ultra 7, the Core i5 and the Core Ultra 5. Not only does AMD do incredibly well, each of the new Core Ultra 200S models is beaten by its equivalent 14th gen Raptor Lake. Our final game is Cyberpunk 2077 on 1080p at Ultra Preset. Top of the chart we have 3 AMD processors. King of the heap once again Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, followed by the Zen 4 7800X 3D, and then the Ryzen 9 9950X. Then we have the 3 Core Ultra 200S parts, and they're in order: Ultra 9, Ultra 7, Ultra 5. After that we have the other 2 AMD Zen 5 parts, the Ryzen 7 and the Ryzen 5, and finally we have the 3 Raptor Lake parts. This chart is surely what we would expect to see in many games, where Core Ultra 200S handily beats Raptor Lake, but the AMD 3D parts are kings of the heap. But as you've seen, the results in our various games tests have been pretty much unpredictable. In pure CPU tests, Intel's done well. In the games, it's all over the place. And we move on to my conclusions about these 3 processors. But of course we also have to consider the platform as a whole. A motherboard is a necessity, and really to get the best out of these processors you not only need DDR5 memory, ideally you want some CU DIMMs DDR5. So there's money to be talked about. The 3 motherboards I used in my testing, so the Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Master X, which is obviously now previous generation, that sells at the moment in the UK for £440. This MSI MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi, which I reviewed relatively recently, I liked it a great deal. It was criticised for being slightly expensive at £450. However, the MSI Meg Z890 Ace currently sells for £650. It's £200 on top of this carbon Wi-Fi, and in the great scheme of things the 2 boards are basically equal, albeit I do have still to do an actual standalone review of the Meg Ace and also of this Gigabyte Z890 Aorus Pro Ice, white in colour as the name suggests. And we have here 2 ASRoCs. I've done a showcase, I've got at least 5 around the studio. This is a Micro ATX and that's a Mini ITX. There are loads of Z890 boards out there in all sorts of form factors, all sorts of specifications, but of course the motherboard's irrelevant if you don't decide that you want the appropriate processor. We also have a question mark over the future of the Z890 platform, because we're not expecting to see new processors using the LGA 1851 socket this year. Panther Lake is going to be laptop only, and then next year when we see Nova Lake, all being well, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if that uses a new socket. So it's entirely possible this platform is 1 generation only. And my conclusions of the Core Ultra 9 285K. The multi-core performance matches Ryzen 9 9950X. The single core performance is decent. The power draw is slightly improved from 14th gen Raptor Lake. Cons, the negatives. The price is far too steep. £600, no. The sooner Intel cuts that price, the better. Secondly, gaming performance is hit and miss. The memory performance exhibits high latency, and my award for the Core Ultra 9 285K is a worth considering. Core Ultra 7 265K, pros, the good points. Decent all-round performance that generally sticks closely to the Ultra 9 285K. It delivers a very pleasant gaming experience, and the price at £380 is quite reasonable. Cons, the negative points. The future of the LGA 1851 socket is vague, and you may have no upgrade path in the future. Gaming performance of the Ultra 7 265K struggles to match the Core i7 14700K, but despite that I'm giving it a worth buying, and that's in the sense of, if you're looking to buy one of these processors of the 3 I've reviewed, the Ultra 7 is my pick of the bunch. It's entirely possible one of the non-K SKUs running on lower power at lower cost might be a better all-round buy. But as things stand, I'm going with the Ultra 7 265K. And then we come to the Core Ultra 5 245K, and I had great hopes for this processor because traditionally the Core i5 has been good. Cheap, effective, not stonking performance, but it does a good job. This time round, I was not won over. Pros, the good points. The general performance of the Core Ultra 5 245K matches the Ryzen 7 9700X. The power consumption of Core Ultra 5 245K is low compared to the other Core Ultra 200S processors, and the memory bandwidth with DDR5 CU DIMMs is impressive for a budget processor. Cons, the negative points. Gaming performance is on a par with the Ryzen 5 9600X, and the total cost of the platform for this budget processor ends up being too high for relatively mediocre performance. And therefore I'm giving the Core Ultra 5 a worth considering, just like the Core Ultra 9. It's been a long struggle from the original launch of Arrow Lake to this point where we've actually been able to review the processors for real, and now we've done it, we can finally take a look at the corresponding motherboards. Don't forget, we're on TikTok and it's kitguru.net on the web.